All right.
Okay.
Hello, everybody. Welcome back to the comprehensive but informal study of critique of pure reason. I'm here with Patrick today, and we're going to
Uh,
be doing the on space section. Anything you want to say, Patrick?
uh, it's been a few weeks since we last touched on this, so we have to get more into the flow of things after finals wrapped up. So excuse us if we are a little bit less connected with this one.
Yeah, for sure. I'm at home, and Patrick, are you at Drew right now?
No, I'm also at home, so
Oh,
no.
okay. So we're both at home, yeah, different environments. So we may be a little more disconnected than we usually are, but I was looking over this beforehand, and honestly, I don't think it'll be as problematic of a section as some others are. So we can try to do this. Also, I'm not sure, Patrick, if you want to go over the whole on space section, or if you just want to touch on like the metaphysical thing and then save the transcendental exposition for another video or another session. But
Well, how long do we have?
unlimited time. I'm not
No,
limited.
I'm sorry. I'm not asking about time. I'm asking how many pages.
Oh, overall, so the whole on space section is 5 pages.
Uh, let's cut it down then.
Okay, cool. So today we'll just be doing the
Metaphysical exposition.
yes, the first section, the metaphysical exposition of this concept, which is space. So Um, just to recap really quick before we start as well. Last time we started the transcendental aesthetic, which is the first half, so to speak, not really in quantity, but conceptually, I guess, the first half of the critique after the introduction. It begins and it goes over intuitions and sensibility and appearances generally. So that's what we'll be talking about, and Kant wants to break down the two pure intuitions we receive, which if you want to know what those are and you don't, see our previous video. But yeah, so we're going into those now on space and on time, the two pure intuitions. So do you want me to read the beginning, Patrick, or you can do
I
it?
can start.
Okay, sure, go ahead.
By means of outer sense, a property of our mind, we represent to ourselves objects as outside of us, and all as in space. In space, their shape, magnitude, and relation to one another is determined, or determinable. Inner sense, by means of which the mind intuits itself, or its inner state gives, to be sure, no intuition of the soul itself as an object. Yet it is still a determinate form, under which the intuition of its inner state is alone possible. So that everything that belongs to the inner determinations is represented in relations of time. Time can no more be intuited externally than space can be intuited as something in us. So, this first part is the idea that space is the form of outer sense. That is to say, things outside of us immediately, whereas time is inner sense. So that does follow that what we perceive directly is not our body per se. That's not internal, because obviously our bodies are organized in space. So he is implicitly claiming that we, as in our experience, is not our body by making the claim that space is external to us.
Right, yeah, it's sort of like the condition of possibility for external objects, which he'll get more into later on. But yeah, essentially, what I think the core of this first little excerpt is, yeah, basically drawing that line, kind of like Descartes did in his meditations, between like the inner and outer senses, intuitions, as Kant calls them. Um, yeah, cool.
Okay. Now, what are space and time? Are they actual entities? Are they only determinations or relations of things, yet ones that would pertain to them even if they were not intuited? Or are they relations that only attach to the form of intuition alone, and thus to the subjective constitution of our mind, without which these predicates could not be ascribed to anything at all? In order to instruct ourselves about this, we will expound the concept of space. First, I understand. How should I read this?
I
In
guess.
order, I'm going to just read this straight up the
Yeah,
way
that's
it's
that's what
written.
I was gonna say. Just might as well just to get a feel for it.
I guess, even though it does not make sense. In
No.
order to instruct ourselves about this, we will expound the concept of space first. I understand by exposition, expositio, the distinct, even if not complete, representation of that which belongs to a concept. But the exposition is metaphysical when it contains that which exhibits the concept as given a priori. Um, okay, so what will I say about this? I think there are two things to sort of break this down a little bit more. He
Hmm.
says that space and time, what are they? Are they actual like entities that subsist basically on their own? Is there such a thing as absolute space, or are they um, relative and inactual things, or relative and just having to do with the subjective state of our experience, which is original to Kant, this idea that time and space are subjective components of our experience. At least in the Western tradition, it is original to Kant. Um, and then the second part, he's saying that he's going to give an exposition of space. And he calls that a representation of that which belongs to a concept, which I don't understand.
I understand by exposition. The distinct. Um. Hmm. Distinct, even if not complete representation. I don't know if this has to do with space more so just like
No, he's just talking about what he's going to do, and he
yeah.
says he's going to give an exposition of it. And then he tried to define exposition, and I don't find his definition particularly clear. But I also don't know if it's relevant. I think it's funny that he puts the effort into defining a term like exposition and misses some other terms at other points.
Yeah. Um yeah, I mean I think an important thing maybe to grasp out of this is the latter end of it, where he talks about like what a metaphysical exposition is.
That
Um
what exhibits the concept as given a priori. Okay, yeah, that makes sense.
yeah, yeah, and I think that's um interesting because it says yeah, that which exhibits the concept as given a priori. So I guess something is like a metaphysical exposition when you're exploring its nature, kind of like how he's just tackling this whole subject matter of like human knowledge and how or his specific question that he created, right? Like how are synthetic judgments a priori possible? That's sort of like a metaphysical exposition. He's exploring like the nature of it in terms of a priori and givenness versus spontaneity, which is a really interesting philosophical concept. I don't know if we should go too much into it here because that might derail, but I do think it's interesting that he defines it metaphysical specifically as given a priori. That's like interesting phrasing for me because it seems to me at least these maybe assumptions that he I think defends later on, but he kind of just establishes that here. So I don't know. I think that's some interesting. I think it's an interesting definition of metaphysical exposition, and it's definitely a little controversial, at least with the givenness part. A priori, I think. I don't know. I mean, some people argue with space that it's not a priori, but especially the given part too. That's fairly controversial. But anyway, I don't know. Is there anything else out of this section you wanted to go into, Patrick?
Uh, I don't think so.
Cool. Um, I can pick up the this little first point. Space is not an empirical concept that has been drawn from outer experience. In order for certain sensations to be related to something outside me, that is to something in another place in space from that in which I find myself, thus in order for me to represent them as outside and next to one another, thus not merely as different, but as in different places, the representation of space must already be there. Thus the representation of space cannot be obtained from the relations of outer appearance and experience, but this outer experience is itself first possible only through representation. So what Kant is saying here, he's basically taking a stance in a debate that had been going on for some time. I don't know exactly when it started, but it was definitely at least related, or at least it was very much became popular with Leibniz and Newton, because they had competing views of space. I believe Leibniz argued for space as like an absolute like concept in itself, really not having to do with
You have it
relations.
backwards.
Oh, I do have it
I
backwards?
think you have it backwards.
Yes. Oh, yes,
so
I do.
I'm
No,
pretty
you're right.
sure
Okay,
Newton
you're
believed in
right.
absolute space, and
Right.
Leibniz believed in relative space.
Yes, in relational space. And that means basically, in Leibniz's view, as Patrick rightly corrected me, is basically the relationship, the relation between two objects in terms of like, I want to say there's space, but like that's a weird like self-defining. It's basically what's between two objects that are not like the same thing physically, like they're two different locations, and what is between them, that would be space, but that's purely relational, defined by the objects in the Leibnizian view. And Kant is going more along the Newtonian lines. I mean, definitely not the same lines, because this is, as Patrick stated earlier, this is definitely an original metaphysical stance.
I
That
don't see how Kant is going more along Newtonian lines.
in sense of that, like space is a thing in itself and not a relational. That's really it.
It's not a thing in itself.
Yes, it's a representation.
It's not a thing in itself. It's a reference. Yes, and it's not a thing in itself.
Okay.
It's a representation.
Sorry. I'm not using thing in itself in the Kantian terms. I'm using thing in itself in like as opposed to relational.
Okay, well, could you scroll back a little bit?
Scroll
like to the last page?
Yeah.
If you look at the previous page, he says in the sentence, or are they relations, right where that is, yeah, or are they relations that only attach to the form of intuition alone, and thus subjective constitution of our mind, without which these predicates could not be ascribed to anything at all. So if you notice these three views that are being given, the first one is Newton's, right? Are they actual entities? The second one, are they only determinations of things, yet ones that would pertain to them even if they were not intuited, which is Leibniz's view, that space is relative, but it's also part of the constitution of things. And then the last one, we can only presume, is supposed to be an exposition of Kant's own view. Or are they relations which only attach to the form of intuition alone, and thus to the subjective constitution of our mind, without which these predicates cannot be ascribed to anything at all? But notice the first phrase of that, or are they relations rather than entities? So it seems from that Kant is saying that space and time are subjective relations. That's more of a Leibnizian view.
But if you look at the end of this paragraph here, thus the representation of space cannot be obtained from the relations of outer appearance through... Okay, so I guess maybe it's like an a priori relation, that, but it cannot be determined, like, as I guess Leibniz would argue, that through relations of outer appearances through experience.
Well, I don't understand how there could be a relation a priori without anything to relate to something else.
Right.
So
Well,
I'm frankly just confused.
And then also, if you look later on, we'll get to where he says, shoot, where is it? One can very well think that there are no objects to be encountered in it, and it being space. So Kant thinks that you can... So here's why I think it's a more Newtonian... Obviously, it's not a purely Newtonian view, because it's not an actual, like, objective object, but it's a, like Kant says, it's a subjective a priori intuition as opposed to just a purely relational thing. Um, because
Well, I think more
to even have relations of things, you need space to begin with in the Kantian view. Um,
sure. More importantly, Kant takes this sort of out of the realm of what could be refuted by scientific discovery, right?
right, because this
Because
is an
Newton's
empirical
idea of
space.
absolute space, for instance, is pretty much untenable now, right? Because we have general relativity. But the theory of absolute space for Newton is both what space metaphysically is and what space observably is. But for Kant, this is simply what our own experience of space is.
Yes, but it's not an empirical like intuition as like probably a lot of. Uh, honestly, I'm not too well versed in like Newtonian like metaphysics, so I'm not sure like what his exact views of space were in terms of like the metaphysical scope, whether he was talking about empirical space or like more along the lines of like an intuition of space. But
Well, I
um,
don't think I don't think Newton would have made any kind of distinction between different kinds of space. Right.
right,
I don't think
which is an
Kant would
important.
either.
No, well, no, that's what Kant is doing. Kant is uh, saying
Well,
there's
Kant's
a.
not saying
Sorry, go ahead.
Kant is defining space as this subjective condition. He doesn't have an
Which is,
alternate proposition of what space is.
but I think he's talking about something different than Newton. If Newton's not making a distinction between empirical and like metaphysical space.
I think we can look back and sort of say that, right? So right now, right, if we've got general relativity, that is a physical model of how space works.
Right.
But it also cannot be directly experienced as like you could not directly experience the curvature of space, for instance, as a human being.
Mhm. Right,
You could
but
not directly experience that kind of four-dimensional distortion.
mhm.
Distortion. Distortion. Why did I say distortion? Anyway, so what Kant is talking about is space as um, component of any potential experience, not as physical model of the universe.
Right, exactly. Which is why it's different than Newton. But the only reason I drew the similarity is because I was is just to get across the idea that space is not really relational for Kant. That was my understanding up to this point. I mean, like you pointed out, there is this weird bit here on the first page. Um, I mean, maybe he's just throwing that out there as a possibility, and that's not his view. Um,
I suppose, but
uh,
I don't know how that would be possible.
I don't know.
If we,
Well, we can try to read on and maybe figure it out more if you want.
yes, let's do that.
Do you want to do the second point here?
Okay, space is a necessary representation a priori that is the ground of all outer intuitions. One can never represent that there is no space, though one can very well think that there are no objects to be encountered in it. Is that true? I don't think that's true.
I remember a few sessions ago you were like contesting this idea. Um, and
Yeah.
honestly,
So
I think it depends on what he means by objects because like sure, I guess I can imagine space as just like in the context of like it taking the form of like pure blackness or something, but like or a pure color, but like it's really hard to get rid of like color from my like uh
okay,
imagination.
but look what he says in the prior context. Space is a necessary representation a priori. That is the ground of all outer intuitions. Well, color is an intuition, right? So it seems to me that he must be taking objects in terms of intuitions, right?
Right.
Not conceptual objects, right? Because
Mm-hmm.
I have to use my understanding to decide that there is an object such as a table, a chair, etc., right?
Mm-hmm.
But I directly intuit colors, for instance, or sounds, etc., etc. And so trying to internally represent or imagine space with no intuitions in it does not seem possible.
Yeah. Hmm. Uh, there's a hmm. There's a footnote, but I'm looking and I don't think it's exactly real. Yeah, that's not related at all.
So, so this seems like a potential concern. But
Yes,
moving
I
on,
agree. I agree. That is strange.
moving on, it
Yeah.
is therefore to be regarded as the condition of the possibility of experiences, not as a determination dependent on them, and is an a priori representation that necessarily grounds outer experiences, which is just a restatement of what he already said.
Yes. Um. Yep. So that's weird. Yeah, I don't really have anything else to say about that. I don't think other than that's like, um,
If you're watching this later, let us know if you can imagine space with literally nothing in it, because I
yeah,
can't.
hit me up if you can imagine if you have this interesting mental capacity that Kant seems to be claiming to have. Because I'm guessing
Yeah,
he thought he
apparently.
could do it if he wrote it down. He seems pretty confident. I mean, Kant just writes confidently, so I don't know.
Yeah,
Maybe he's
he
just
he seems to think that. Yes.
yeah, yeah. So yeah, if you have that Kantian ability, let us know. Okay.
I mean, who knows? He's a weird guy. Maybe he could.
Yeah. Dang, that's cool. If it, I guess good ability that allows you to put together
Very useful ability. The ability to imagine nothing.
Yeah, I mean, no, you're imagining pure space, and that's a pure intuition. It is definitely not nothing in the Kantian view, and I guess it allowed Kant to make this metaphysical insight. So that is still contestable,
I,
but interesting. um,
all right.
yeah. All right, I can do number 3. Space is not a discursive or, as is said, general concept of relations of things general, but a pure intuition. For, first, one can only represent a single space, and if one speaks of many spaces, one understands by that only parts of one and the same unique space. And these parts cannot, as it were, precede the single all encompassing space as its components from which its composition would be possible, but rather are only thoughts in it. It is essentially single, the manifold in it. Thus, also the general concept of spaces in general rests merely on limitations. From this it follows that in respect to it, an a priori intuition, which is not empirical, grounds all concepts of it. Thus, also all geometrical principles, e.g., that in a triangle two sides together are always greater than the third, are never derived from general concepts of line and triangle, but are rather derived from intuition and indeed derived a priori with apodictic certainty. Yeah, so the first part, well, maybe the whole part, but at least from the first part, I can safely say that he's trying to say that if you want to break space up into bits and have quote unquote multiple spaces, they're really just subspaces of the great all encompassing space. The single all encompassing space, as he puts it right here. Um, yeah, so space is really just one big ass pure intuition that encompasses literally every other intuition that we could possibly have. Um,
Well,
and
not internal intuitions.
no, yes, sorry, yes, outer intuitions. My apologies. That is a very important distinction to make. Um, yeah, so
Yes.
any basically any objects. Well, actually, that's too
Well, and he
narrow.
also says that this is the ground. This is how a priori synthetic geometry is possible.
Yes, that's the rolling on to the second bit, which I'm trying to think of like a good, simple way to explain it that isn't just like purely rehashing what he's saying. Do you have anything for this?
I think he's basically saying that it's not by analyzing triangles conceptually, but by relating the concept of triangle in a given space, right, that we can draw propositions about the triangle. And so the space, which is given to us, is the necessary component that allows us to make synthetic propositions about the triangle. So, for instance, if we take a triangle has 180-degree angles. All the angles of a triangle add up to 180 degrees all the time. And Kant would say that sorry, let me clarify. All the time on a Euclidean plane, which is to say a two-dimensional plane which is not curved and anything like that, right? Okay, so what Kant would say is that it's not the triangle which lets us know that there's 180 degrees in it. It's not by analyzing the triangle, but by relating that essentially, or exploring its internal relationships in a given space, right? And that would be the Euclidean plane itself. So we're exploring really the relationship between space, which is given to us, and a concept of a triangle, and that's how we get these synthetic propositions about the triangle.
And I remember when I first learned about this, I found that argument really convincing, but I don't know. I'm having doubts about it. I just don't know if that's how like mathematical cognition works.
Well, I mean, when we look at a Euclidean plane as something given to us in intuition, that's what Kant would say. But really, a Euclidean plane is something that's defined, right?
Right.
So I'm not sure that it is an intuition. And when I have a concept of a triangle, right, it seems to me that I actually have a different concept of quote, a triangle on a Euclidean plane and on a non-Euclidean plane, right? Because if I think of a triangle on a non-Euclidean surface, like the surface of the Earth, right, the Bermuda Triangle, it would be a non-Euclidean triangle because it's on the surface of the Earth and the Earth is curved, right?
Right.
So it doesn't have to add up to 180. Well, it seems to me that those are two different concepts of a triangle, right?
Yeah.
One with the Euclidean plane and one in the non-Euclidean plane. And so maybe by analyzing it, I could come up with the 180 or whatnot. But
Yeah.
I don't know. That's sort of advanced. It just doesn't seem obvious to me what Kant is saying.
Yeah. I think you explained it pretty well, though. Yeah, I don't know. That's really all I have for that. I don't have too many opinions other than like, I guess so. Like, I don't know. I'll need to think about that more and read more, I guess, about that. Try to get a better grip, or to get more conviction, I guess. All right, though.
Okay.
Moving on. Space is space is represented as an infinite given magnitude. Now, one must, to be sure, think of every concept as a representation that is contained in an infinite set of different possible representations as their common mark, which thus contains these under itself, but no concept as such can be thought as if it contained an infinite set of representations within itself. Nevertheless, space is so thought, for all the parts of space, even to infinity, are simultaneous. Therefore, the original representation of space is an a priori intuition, not a concept.
Okay.
That's the end of the... Yes, okay, that is the end of that section. Okay.
Let's
Yeah, go ahead.
try to break that down because I don't understand a lot of that actually.
Yeah, that's
Space is represented. Space is represented as an infinite given magnitude. That makes sense, right?
Yes.
This idea that if we are to imagine space, we can always put an object, like we always have the capacity to imagine an object outside of any space we are thinking, right? So there is no limit to it in our given representation of space. So that makes sense.
Yeah, I agree with that.
Now, one must, to be sure, think of every concept as a representation that is contained in an infinite set of different possible representations. So, what's he saying there? Now, one must, to be sure, think of every concept as a representation that is contained in an infinite set of different possible. Okay, so every concept, right, is a representation, and if we take an infinite set of all the representations,
Yep.
that representation, whatever it is, X falls under that.
Yeah.
Okay. That makes sense, obviously.
Yeah.
Um, thus, which contains these under itself.
So basically,
What is
all
these?
are the thus contains these under.
What does the pronoun these mean here?
At first, I thought he was talking about the set of different possible representations, but that I feel like wouldn't really make sense.
Thus contains these under itself. I don't get it, but moving on. Thus, no concept as such can be thought of can be thought as if it contained an infinite set of representations within itself. Okay. Aha! Okay, 1 second. The thoughts are turning.
Okay.
Okay, I see. So this is an argument for why space is not a concept, but an intuition.
Mm-hmm.
The argument runs like this.
Okay.
Anytime we have a concept, um, so he's saying a
Okay. I think
concept
I get
cannot
it
be
too.
thought. Yes, a concept cannot be thought as if it contained an infinite set of representations within itself. Basically, in order for a concept to have infinite different things within itself, to have an infinite concept, you would need to have an infinite mind because a concept is thought actively.
Yes.
So you would have to basically conceive to actually think of everything contained within the concept, right?
Yes.
Which space does not demand that you do, because rather than you thinking it, it's just given to you.
Mm.
Okay, so I think that made sense to you, but to break this down just to even like a lower to like a more basic level, because this is very tricky and very subtle.
Yeah.
The distinction here is between uh, being given something, which is a little bit obscure, and more clearly thinking of something. You cannot think in infinite thought. You cannot think of everything that could ever possibly be in space, because that would require that you had an infinite mind. Makes enough sense, right? But don't worry about that because you don't need to think of an infinite space. Space is simply given to you, right? It does not. It's not necessarily given from outside, but the point is it's sort of there, kind of mysteriously.
Yeah. I mean, both the origins of intuitions and concepts are both mysterious, like spooky things in Kant's philosophy that we encountered earlier in the when the transcendental aesthetic began. But
I think it's only natural that space and time are spooky. Experience is fundamentally spooky.
yeah. I'm not saying that as like a knock on Kant. It's just like
Yeah.
the fact that these aren't like very obvious or trivial things is fine. Like that's understandable. But what was I going to? I was going to say something. Oh, okay. I like your thing. I was thinking something differently, which I don't know if this is right or not, but I'll put the thought forward and see what you think, Patrick. I thought so. I also when I had that like aha moment, I also understood this as an argument for intuition versus a concept, and my line of thinking for that was that basically Kant saying that concepts can't contain themselves and they need to be like to be a representation. A concept can't like concepts in themselves for Kant aren't like representations. So they need to be contained within an intuition to like become a representation.
I don't think that's actually true of representations. I think representation in Kant is actually the most broad term you have.
Okay.
I think, and I can look back on this, but representation, I believe, in Kant includes both intuitions and concepts.
Right.
Like
Well, that's how
anything is
it's
a
made.
representation, right? So if there's something in your mind at all, that's a representation in your in not even just your understanding, in your experience, whatever. It's a representation. All of
Oh.
the above are representations.
Oh.
Substance is
Okay.
a representation. A chair is a representation. Time is a representation. God is a representation, etc., etc. All
Oh.
representations.
Okay. I had a more limited idea of representation where I thought it just kind of like was restricted to um, concepts and intuitions like being applied to, or concepts being applied to intuitions to create something which would be called representation. That's what I was more thinking along the lines of, but you
I
could
don't
be
think that's
right.
correct,
Okay.
but I would have to look back into it. I wish he had like a glossary of his own terms. He should.
I will honestly real quick look in the index for representation and see, unless he doesn't define it and you know that, then there's no point. But let me see here. QR.
Yeah.
Representation. 398, bruh. Why does he
Right.
define it so
Okay.
late? Let's see here. Sorry, you can say something while I'm looking for this.
Sure. Most of the external sources are saying that representations include both intuitions and concepts.
Hmm. Okay. Okay, so I looked in the index and I got to the point where representation is first bolded as like they are here, like when it's like a
Uh huh.
uh, I don't know exactly what you would call the method of bolding in this book, but where it is first bolded in this translation, it Kant says, uh, "We are not so lacking in terms properly suited to each species of representation that we have need for one to encroach on the property of another. Here is the progression. The genus is representation in general. Under it stands the representation with consciousness, which is perception, and a perception that refers to the subject as modification of its state is a sensation. An objective perception is a cognition. The latter is either an intuition or a concept. Okay, so it goes representation, perception, sensation, cognition. Wait, no, that can't be right. Why would cognition come after sensation? I don't know. That's really strange to me.
I don't think cognition is under sensation. I think
Right.
sensation is a subjective kind of representation, which is empirical, and
Oh,
all of
right.
these are subjective in the sense of being in the subject. But sensation, I think, is supposedly in the subject and of the subject,
Right.
whereas intuition is in the subject of something else. And
Right.
concepts are also in the subject of something else.
Right. So yes. So represent. So cognition. So what you're describing, yes. So that's cog. So the objective perceptions. So an objective perception is what calls a cognition. And what are these objective representations? Intuitions or concepts. Okay. And then that all falls under representation. Okay. So you're correct. That took a bit long, I guess, to figure that out. But okay, you're right. So your argument is
Yes, he says representation is the genus in general. So
yes. Okay.
representation is the most broad thing here, is the
Okay.
point.
I'm glad I understand that. Okay. Cool. Sweet. Yeah, and then that's pretty much it for I guess now, because next up is Transcendental Exposition of Space, which we will get into next time. Is there anything else you want to say about this section in general, Patrick?
Um, uh, not about this section, I don't think. Although it seems to be a weird ambiguity because I'm pretty sure I cannot represent space without anything in it.
Yeah,
It
that's
seems like
the
there needs to be,
yeah something in it. Yeah.
yeah.
Huh. Hmm. it is a weird claim, but honestly, do you think that his like whole um, like this whole notion he's putting forward of like space being an a priori intuition, do you think that is really essential to it, or do you think he's just trying to like get the reader to understand what he's talking about?
Well, it seems to be an argument against the relationality of space, right?
Yes.
So
Okay.
he's saying that space is a pure intuition that is given to us, right,
Mm,
prior to us being able to have anything in it. But it seems like we actually need both at once at the same time,
mm,
right? It
yeah.
seems like we can't have space without um, some kind of thing for it, like in the space, any more than we can have the thing without the space. And he seems to want to say that we can have space without the things. And that's how we know it's prior to everything else. So
Yeah.
I do think it's actually kind of important.
Yeah. Um, I'm just trying to think, because honestly, the only like intuition that I feel like is inherently necessary with space is some sort of color, or at least shade, like black or like I don't know if I just
Well,
have like a
that's the
really
way we imagine things, but I'm not sure if people who are born blind are like experiencing blackness all the time.
yeah. I guess I just have like a limited cognition because of my experience. I don't know.
It could be.
Or maybe not even my experience. Maybe it's just that.
However, regardless, I can definitely imagine, even though I need to imagine blackness because I think I just am somehow wired to always need to have some kind of visual with my imagination.
That's what I'm saying.
But
Like
I
I feel like
can,
I just have limited cognition. Like Kant seems to have some higher
okay,
form
but
of.
okay, but nevertheless, definitely you can have um, an imagination. I can know that like a sound is in one space. A sound could be to my right, and another sound could be to my left, and I can imagine that. Okay, so those two sounds, not just sights, could also be organized in space.
Mhm.
So I could at least conceptualize how someone might be able to imagine um, space without seeing anything, or without color,
Right,
or
but
anything
that's
like that.
that's still relying on an intuition though.
Exactly, it's still
Yeah,
reliant on some kind of intuition. Space with absolutely nothing in it, it seems like that would be simply nothing.
yeah.
So it seems like that would be an imagination of nothing at all.
Yeah, the only
A
way I was able
completely,
really to make sense of this is like an abstract, like I don't know, like concept, but like not the concept in this sense, but like just an
but it's
abstract
not a
idea.
concept.
No, no, yeah, I
But
mean,
abstractions, but that's the problem. Abstractions are concepts in Kant, right? Because we actively have to create an abstraction by
oh right,
abstracting away from intuition.
yeah, and then honestly,
So it
that
cannot
does
be
seem
abstract either.
okay, yeah. Hmm. Do you think any of that is fixed by his argument in the fourth? Maybe not fixed, but like, do you think there's any
No,
depth or rigor at? Okay.
no, I really don't, to be honest. I think it makes sense to say that space is a necessary precondition of our experience, but it seems like if that's so, then some kind of other intuition is also a necessary precondition of our experience. Or I don't know. I don't know. I really don't know. I haven't been able to parse it, and I also don't. It's not been something that I have needed in my particular philosophical areas of interest. But I'm
Hmm.
not sure that this equation adds up.
Yeah. I don't know. I'm convinced that it is necessary as well. But I don't know. The whole yeah, it as an intuition I think is a bit strange. But that might just be because I've been reading Hegel, and Hegel thinks everything's derived from concepts. So read Hegel, kids. uh, yeah, I don't know. I think that's all I have, and I don't know. Anything else, or are we good here?
I think we're good.
All right. In that case. case, we'll see you all next time for the transcendental exposition of space, which seems to be interesting. As you can see here, we'll get into it. Thanks for joining, everybody. Bye.